Welcome back to BadgerBlitz TV, your Rivals.com destination for all things Wisconsin athletics. Once again, I'm Matt Perkins with some good news, or at least I hope it's good news for those of you who are watching. We will now be coming to you twice a week. You are already used to hearing me and Clint Cosgrove talk about recruiting. Now you get me and John coming at you every week, starting this week to talk about, well, whatever the heck we want to talk about related to Badger football, maybe some basketball later on, volleyball, who knows, hockey. Either way, it is the publisher of BadgerBlitz.com, John McNamara. Great to see you as always, my friend.
Great to see you too, Matt. Thank you for carving out some time today.
Oh, of course. Of course. You know I love doing this. So you just got back, or got over, I should say, from Media Days over at the McLean Center. And let's just talk big picture here first. John, what was the biggest thing, or the biggest thing, like for you at least, that came out of Media Days?
Yeah, well, quote of the day came from Phil Longo. Very candid in all of his availabilities that he's had so far at Wisconsin. He said he loves three things in this world: his wife, his children, and slot receivers. He was asked about Will Pauling and what he brings to the table, and he kind of spoke glowingly about Will Pauling and Skylar Bell, as well as those two slot receivers, and just about what that position opens up for the offense and how important it is to Phil Longo's offense. And then he mentioned, let me be careful how I say this. He said, I can't talk about the guy that we got coming in. He can't name him specifically, but he's very high on him as well. And I'm guessing that's Kyan Barry Johnson, is, the 4-star receiver committed to Wisconsin's 2024 class that, is cut from the same cloth as, Will Pauling and kind of Skylar Bell as well, but probably more so Pauling. And, just how important, you and Clint have talked about this so many times, of, Kyan Barry Johnson's, what he brings to the table and his skill set. And obviously the Wisconsin coaching staff thinks very highly of him. And that definitely starts with Phil Longo as the offensive coordinator.
Yeah, I would imagine Tresh Kekahuna is kind of cut from that same cloth as well. I'm excited to see how he develops over the next couple of years. I mean, you mentioned Will Pauling. I was fortunate enough to spend some time with him over at Squat Fest last month, and you see the body, you see the skill set that that he brings, and you can only imagine some of the things that he'll be able to do once he gets a little bit of space. And I guess that for me is one of my biggest questions heading into fall camp. How many receivers are going to receive significant snaps? I mean, we think it's probably going to be about 6, but it would not surprise me if we saw a Vinny Anthony, a Chris Brooks bubble up as well, on top of, the usual suspects that we've been talking about in Chimere DK, Skylar Bell, who you mentioned, and Will Pauling, CJ Williams, Bryson Green, and who I'm missing. I'm missing one other guy off the top of my head right now. Pauling.
Chim
at
the top?
Yeah, Chim at the top. Anyway, it'll be interesting to see how many receivers are getting snaps, especially if they end up going 4 wide a lot. What happens? Or do we see, I'm curious to see, do they use like a Clay Cundiff as a power slot? One of my favorite terms that Clint and I talk about as well. But let's move to the people who need to keep the quarterback upright to get the ball to the guys in the slot, and that's the offensive line, John. And you mentioned something that stood out to you from that Tanner Bortolini said before we just hopped on.
Yeah, and it was brought up at Big Ten Media Days that Jake Renfro, who you project to start at center for Wisconsin, who missed a really large chunk of spring camp, is probably not going to be full go right away. And, I don't know the exact specifics of that, but Tanner Bortolini talked about, he was asked, where do you see yourself starting off when fall camp opens? And he said at center until Jake Renfro is ready to go. So, just kind of shuffling on the offensive line that we saw in the spring. And, Tanner Bortolini is probably your best option behind Jake Renfro. Joe Huber could be there as well, Dylan Barrett. If you have, Joe Brunner, if you needed him to, probably. So, there's a lot of candidates there, but it's probably not what you ideally have, scripted out in terms of your top 5. Kind of a bump in the road to start fall camp, and it'll be very interesting to see just how long Jake Renfro is out. We saw him walking around a little bit at the McLean Center today. So, I wouldn't read a whole lot into that. We didn't get a chance to talk to him. We didn't have an injury update on him. But, when camp opens tomorrow in Platteville, you would expect Bortolini is opening as the number one center because Jake Renfro's not ready to go.
So if Bort does open up as the number one center, I mean, they're pretty set at tackle. We know it's going to be Nelson and Malman at the two tackles. Who do we imagine are going to be opening at the two guard spots? Is Furtney coming back for a 6th year going to be in one of those? Huber going to be in one of those? How do you think it shakes out with Renfro out for the time being?
Yeah, my guess would be Furtney at right guard and then Joe Huber at left guard. That would be my guess. But again, early in fall camp, use a lot of different combinations, so I'm not exactly sure who struts out there with the top unit. But my guess would be, Bortolini in the middle, and then Huber on his left, and Michael Furtney on his right. And like you talked about, those tackles are pretty well set. We got to talk to both Jack Nelson and Riley Malman today, and they're at the left and right respectively. So I think that position is pretty set. But the interior, could be something to definitely watch throughout fall camp.
Well, let's move from the interior of the offensive line to the interior of the defensive line. I think that is one of the most interesting battles and utilizations, I guess I will say, for this defense. Because in the spring, we saw a lot of 2 down linemen on this defense. But essentially there's supposedly at least a base 3-3-5 defense, which means they should have 3 down linemen. But who those 3 linemen are is still a bit up for debate. I think the only guy who is pretty much guaranteed to start is Rodas Johnson. I think you can pen him in at one of the defensive end spots or one of the line spots, whatever you want to call it. But the rest of the jobs, I think, we could be the Temple transfer Varner. You could see James Thompson. Isaiah Mullins, Gio Paez, Kurt Neal. There's a lot of guys that could be contributing. How do you sort of, at least as we enter fall camp, see that shaking out?
There's question marks there for sure. And we got a chance to talk to Rodas Johnson today. And I'd probably agree with you he might be the top lineman coming back or the guy that maybe you expect the most out of. And, I think that's high praise considering, you got a guy like Mullins back for his 6th season. But, if I was to point to one guy I feel pretty good about opening with the top unit, it's probably Rodas Johnson. When we talked to Rodas today, he mentioned himself, surrounded by James Thompson, Isaiah Mullins, and then he had some pretty high praise for on the inside Gio Paez as well. Spoke very highly of him, pointed out that he thought he had a really good bowl game. And he pointed out that he thought he had a really good spring game. We didn't get a chance to talk to Paez today, but with the way Rodas Johnson talked about him, you would imagine that he's a guy who will be in the rotation and, maybe pushing for some starter reps. But, I did that breakdown earlier this morning of, position battles on the defense. It's tough because, you expect them to have some 2 front looks. They had a lot of 2 front looks under Jim Leonard. You would expect some 3-3-5. So you're going to have 3 defensive linemen there lining up. So it's going to be very interesting to see how that shakes. I think those 4 will be at the top with, Darian Varner is kind of that wild card. We didn't get to see him at all in the spring. He's a guy that I think Greg Scuggs used the term of juice. He brings some juice, but he's got to be healthy. So you're going to need as many bodies as possible there. You see those top tier teams in college football be able to rotate their defensive lines. I think Wisconsin wants to do that. If they will be able to do that this year is kind of remains to be a question, I think.
Yeah, to me, the key piece to talk about there is Isaiah Mullins, because he's been a defensive end for his entire career, but it looks like he's going to have to move inside for a combination of need, right? They don't have as many true interior defensive linemen as they have, even, the 5 techniques that they had were utilizing under Jim Leonard. It looks like he's going to have to be inside more. And also, he's a thick guy. They call him Tree for a reason, right? I mean, he is just a big, strong dude. And so I am curious to see how he is deployed under Greg Scruggs, under Mike Tressel, and how this defense, looks with those different pieces. I imagine a lot of those guys are going to be moving around a lot. I'm also interested to see how big Varner is, because we didn't get to see him in the spring at all. Like, how much does he weigh? Like, how much is he actually weighing in at, right? Because I think he was playing at Temple at like 265, I want to say, something like that, 260, 265. The rest of those guys are all 290 and above. And so Is he going to be able to hold up, especially against the run at 265, 270, or has he bulked up in the time between he got on campus and now as they start fall camp? That is something that I'm definitely going to be keeping an eye out on. Another position, though, that you mentioned in your write-up this morning, John, was can CJ Getz keep his starting job at outside linebacker? And we're kind of, we're penciling Daryl Peterson for one outside linebacker spot. I feel like he's in a great spot. He's an outstanding pass rusher. Getz is really good against the run last year. Not as much of a disruptor as an edge rusher. I'm curious to see how Jeff Pietrowski, how some of these other younger guys, get in the outside linebacker rotation. Caden Johnson has had flashes. TJ Bowlers has had flashes. That outside linebacker room and the way that those guys are going to rotate is of a lot of interest to me. And I'm just curious to see, especially like what happens with Getz here.
Yeah, and when I wrote that, it's more so of I think Pietrowski's ready to make a legit run there at him. It's not Getz has been shaky or anything like that. I think it's because they're very high on what Pietrowski brings to the table. Obviously he's coming off an injury too, but had a really, really big season at Michigan State. And I think that's a big reason why Wisconsin went after him so hard. So, you talked to some of the guys too today, and he's a name that's been brought up, even kind of going back to the spring as well. So certainly a guy that's going to be in the rotation. I think that's kind of a given if he's healthy, but also a guy that I think has the potential to push for those top reps as well. Bowlers is the interesting one here. He sits at around 270 pounds, so you would imagine he's a little bit closer to the line of scrimmage. Not a traditional, outside linebacker. Maybe sort of a package guy where you go heavy up there. He's playing. Maybe he plays with his hand on the ground, but again, he's still listed as an outside linebacker. We're scheduled to get a roster drop tomorrow in Platteville, so I know a lot of people waiting for the roster. Some people love the roster. I'm probably one of those people too. So that's not a bad thing, but it'll be interesting to see what he comes in at. I think they like his unique ability at that size because it gives him just kind of another piece to work with. So of the traditional linebackers, those traditional outside linebackers, like you said, Peterson, Getz, Pietrowski, Caden Johnson should be in that mix, and then Bowlers is kind of that wild card. You can put him, in a few different positions and kind of get creative with Mike Tressel and his defense.
Yeah, I'm really excited to see what happens with TJ because he's got the 4-star pedigree. He's got he's 270, but he looks like he's about 4% body fat. I mean, he is cut up. He doesn't look 6'2", 270. I mean, that might be what he's listed at, but I mean, he looks like he's 245. So that just means he's carrying that weight really, really well. Let's move to the back end of the defense in the safety spot. I think Austin Brown is probably the name to really be talking about here in camp. Can he stay healthy and can he really, sort of push this unit over the top?
Yeah, I asked Hunter Wooler about that, specifically about Austin Brown, and he spoke very highly about him. I think those two have Austin Brown and Hunter Wooler have some similarities. And I think that, Hunter Wooler is someone that was talked about a lot today. Luke Fickell talked about him, Mike Tressel talked about him, and, just what he brings to that dollar position and the versatility there. I think Austin Brown has a lot of that as well. And, if a guy like Hunter Wooler wasn't on this roster right now, I think you'd see a lot more Austin Brown. So it'll be interesting to see how Tressel mixes those guys in. You saw in the spring a handful of times where they used the three safety look. So, that's the position that they think is going to be, I would imagine, a strength. And I think Austin Brown is probably too good to leave off the field. I think that he's a guy that you're going to have to put out there because, look, he's got a high ceiling and he's one of the more talented guys, I think, on that defense, one of the more talented young guys on that defense. So I think you have to find ways to get him on the field, but it's tough when you have, guys like Wooler, Kamoy Latu, Travion Blaylock if healthy. So that seems like a strong room to me kind of heading into fall camp.
Yeah, it does. And if you do that three safety look, you're going to have to pull either a linebacker, and we know they are stacked at middle linebacker, at least with their top three. Have Tress has talked about having three starters there, or you're going to have to pull one of those corners off. And I don't think you're pulling Matry off the field as that nickel back. He seems like he's pretty locked in there. Alexander Smith and Ricardo Hallman seem to have locked down those outside corner spots, but it's going to be interesting also to see who sort of that second group of outside corners really is, because I thought Jonas Duclona looked really good in spring ball. I think there's a lot of buzz around Jace Arnold as well when it comes to the freshmen, but there's a lot of guys, there's a lot of unknowns there, but also a lot of upside. And plus, now we get to get our first look at Amari Snowden, who in a lot of ways was the crown jewel of this 2023 class. And I, for one, am very excited to see what he looks like and to see if he's ready for the college game.
Yeah, so I'm gonna rain on your parade a little bit. I think Snowden has a huge ceiling here. If I were to label him right now, I'd put him down for a redshirt season.
Interesting.
That's just from what I'm hearing, and I think it has more to do with the guys that they have returning, and then the two freshmen that took part in spring camp. I think that was so huge for Jace Arnold and Jonas Duclona as well. I think it's put them both in a position to potentially contribute this year. But a guy that's been talked about a lot at Big Ten Media Days and a little bit today as well is the Division II transfer they got, Fort Kareen. I hope I'm saying his name correctly, but I think he's going to be, that next in line at that field or boundary cornerback position. Like you talked about, Matry, I think has that slot pretty well locked down, but behind Hallman and behind Smith, I think Forqueen is going to be the next guy up in line. So I think he's in line for a bunch of reps, but I think they want it to have, just like at receiver, 6 guys ready to play. I think they want to do the same thing at cornerback, but that room is not as nearly as deep as that wide receiver room is.
Then who's the backup in the slot then after Matry?
I'd say Max Lofi, but again, he was coming off a spring where he missed a big chunk of time. And then Amon Williams is another guy I think that fits that slot role as well. So I would look for both of those guys again. Both kind of unproven still. Amon Williams is a guy that pops up every camp, whether it's spring or the fall, and makes some big plays. Likes to talk a lot. Likes to talk a whole lot. A little undersized, but he came as a walk-on, and he's certainly, I think, earned his stripes here. So it'll be interesting to see if a guy like him could crack the 2 deep. But Max Lofi is a guy that I think obviously Jim Leonard was pretty high on coming out of high school, and it just hasn't really clicked for him yet. In terms of being injured or guys ahead of him. So I mean, this is a huge fall camp for him. And I wouldn't call it a make or break, but he could certainly put himself in a position to be a big time contributor this year.
Yeah, that'll definitely be one spot to watch. So I think that's pretty much most of sort of the questions in terms of who's going to be seeing playing time. We know at least the last one would be running back position, sort of who's the number 3 back. Is it Aker? Is it Yakimelli? Is it sort of a little bit of both? I think that Yakimelli probably fits the more of a traditional third down back role with his ability in the open field. But, Aker has pretty much done everything that's been asked of him since he's been on campus. He's been moved around from tailback to fullback, back to tailback. And it would not surprise me in the least if Aker is able to carve out a role for himself here, especially when it comes to, some short yardage packages and things like that.
Yeah, and I asked Ches Malusi about that. Obviously him and Braylon are the established backs, and they're going to command the bulk of the reps there. And he mentioned both the guys you talked about, as well as Grover Bortolotti too, is a guy that could potentially be there. So I don't know. You may not see a true number 3 emerge. I think Yakimelli and Aker, I'm sorry, had very unique skill sets that complement each other well. So, maybe if you want to bring in a guy on third down to protect the quarterback, Aker might be your best bet. But at the same time, if it's third and long, a guy like Yakimelli gives you something a little bit out of the backfield, the guy that can, get out in space and make some plays as well. So I don't know how important it is for a true number 3 to emerge, as long as you feel good about playing both those guys on Saturdays if needed.
Yeah, and then I mean, we might as well talk about some specialists, because it's going to be. I think having a special teams coordinator in Matt Mitchell is going to make a big difference. The special teams has been a bit of a wild ride, shall we say, for the Badgers for the past couple of years. Atticus Bertrams comes in, gotta love an Australian punter, and then you've got a transfer kicker, and it's going to be a different sort of feel for the specialists. Did you get a chance to talk to any of those guys or anyone regarding special teams today?
Not a ton about that, but those Australian punters, they come out, I don't know, they're like stormtroopers. You just order one from the factory and they come out and they punt for you. So I think it's a good sign. Like anytime you have a guy that you're a specialist that you're bringing on scholarship, you expect to that person to come in and command the job and win the job and then do it at a very high level. I can't give you a punting breakdown. I just assume that he's going to come in and be the guy for Wisconsin and hopefully improve there. They were not in a good spot at the end of spring camp. That 15th practice focused a lot on special teams. And, Andy Van Dyke didn't look great. And that was kind of the guy maybe had penciled in there. So I think they went into the offseason saying we have to get better there. And I think they found a pretty good fit there in Bertrams. And again, I would expect him to be the guy unless something crazy happens.
All right. Well, John, let's get out of here. Do you have one bold prediction for us for fall camp?
That people are going to get sick of driving from Madison to Platteville.
Hey,
that's my. I predict beat writers will be vocal on Twitter about midweek about the drive to Platteville and the drive back and all that entails. So that's my bold prediction, at least for week 1 of fall camp.
I love it. Well, fortunately for me, at least, I don't have to drive to Platteville every day, because then again, if I had to do that from Nashville, that would be quite the drive. So nonetheless, you can keep up with all of the best coverage anywhere on the internet or in the world or the galaxy on your Wisconsin Badgers here at BadgerBlitz.com. So until next time, I'll be back later this week with Clint talking recruiting. John and I will be back next week to talk everything going on at camp. And so until next time, we will see you all in the den.